The year is roughly 2560 BCE. You're born in a small mudbrick village on the banks of the Nile, and the very first sound you probably ever hear is the river itself, water moving steadily past reed banks, the same rhythm your family has lived by for generations. Your world from the very beginning is shaped entirely by that river. Your village sits close enough to benefit from its yearly flood, far enough to avoid the worst of it, clustered among dozens of similar small farming communities strung along the Nile's fertile banks. There's no Egypt in the sense of a single unified nation the way you might picture it. There's the river, the land it feeds, and the people who have built their entire existence around its rhythm. You're one of several children in your family, though not all of your siblings will survive childhood. Infant mortality here is brutally common, something your parents have already learned to carry quietly rather than dwell on. Your father works the land like nearly everyone in your village. Your mother manages the household, grinds grain, weaves cloth, and somehow keeps your growing family fed through both abundance and scarcity, depending entirely on how generous the river happens to be that particular year. By the time you're old enough to walk steadily, you're already expected to help, fetching water, watching younger siblings, learning the basic rhythms of farming life simply by existing inside it every single day. There's no formal schooling waiting for you here, not for a family like yours. Your education is the village itself, the river, the fields, the animals, and the elders who teach you everything you'll ever need to know through repetition and example rather than books. You don't know it yet, sitting in the mud outside your family's home, watching the Nile drift past exactly the way it has for as long as anyone can remember. But not far from here, something enormous is beginning to rise from the desert sand, and one day your own life is going to become part of building it. Your home is small, built from mud brick dried in the sun, walls thick enough to stay cool despite the relentless heat outside. A single main room serves most purposes: cooking, sleeping, daily life. With a flat roof you'll spend plenty of evenings on, since sleeping outdoors under the stars is often more comfortable than the heat trapped indoors. Clothing here is simple and practical, shaped entirely by the climate rather than fashion. Most of what you wear is plain linen woven from flax grown along the riverbanks, a simple wrap skirt for men, a longer dress for women, both left deliberately loose and breathable. Children often go without much clothing at all until they're older, since fabric takes real labor to produce, and the heat makes it genuinely unnecessary for very young kids running around the village. Food follows the same practical logic. Bread and beer form the absolute backbone of your diet. Bread from emmer wheat ground laboriously by hand, beer brewed thick and nutritious, closer to a meal than a drink by modern standards. You eat vegetables when they're available, onions, leeks, lentils, along with fish pulled regularly from the Nile itself, a genuinely reliable protein source most families depend on. Meat is rarer, saved mostly for festivals or wealthier households, though your family might occasionally afford it during particularly good harvest years. Bathing happens in the river itself, a daily practical necessity rather than a luxury, and you learn early which parts of the Nile are safer than others, avoiding the crocodiles that make certain stretches genuinely dangerous. Life here isn't comfortable by modern standards, but it's stable, structured, and deeply repeatedly familiar. The same rhythms your parents lived and their parents before them. Everything about your life, and everyone else's life in this village, revolves around a single yearly cycle that never really changes: the Nile's flood. Each year, around the same predictable time, the river rises and spreads across the surrounding farmland, depositing a thick layer of dark, fertile silt as the water eventually recedes. This flooding season, which you've heard elders call Akhet, is actually a relatively quiet time for farming families. The fields are underwater, unworkable, and much of the physical labor briefly pauses. It's during exactly this season, you'll later learn, that the Pharaoh's massive building projects tend to need extra hands the most, since farmers have nothing else demanding their time. Once the floodwaters recede, planting season begins. Hooray! And your family's entire household turns toward the fields, sowing emmer wheat and barley into that freshly enriched soil. You're old enough now to actually help, walking behind adults, learning how seeds get pressed into damp earth, how irrigation channels get maintained and redirected to keep water reaching every section of farmland efficiently. Finally comes harvest season, Shemu, the most physically demanding period of the entire year. Everyone works, cutting grain by hand, threshing it, storing what your family needs while a portion gets collected as tax, owed to local officials representing the pharaoh's authority. This isn't presented to you as unfair exploitation exactly. It's simply how things work, the same way the flood itself simply happens every year, an accepted, unquestioned part of how your entire world operates. The river isn't just practical infrastructure to your family and your entire community. It's sacred, deeply tied to the gods themselves, believed to be controlled by divine forces that require proper respect and ritual to keep functioning correctly. Which brings us to something equally central to your entire life here, what you actually believe, and how those beliefs shape almost everything you do. Religion for you isn't a separate part of life you visit occasionally. It's woven into nearly everything, present in ways so constant you barely notice it as a distinct category of experience. You grow up understanding that dozens of gods govern different aspects of existence. Ra, the sun god, crossing the sky each day in his solar bark. Osiris, ruler of the afterlife, whose story of death and resurrection shapes how your entire community understands what happens after you die. Isis, Hathor, Anubis, each with their own domains, temples, and rituals, your family observes with varying degrees of regularity depending on your household's means and local customs. Small household shrines are common even in humble homes like yours. Simple offerings of food or beer left for household gods believed to protect your family specifically. Amulets, worn by nearly everyone regardless of wealth, are believed to offer real, practical protection against illness, misfortune, and malevolent spirits. You've worn one yourself for as long as you can remember, rarely even thinking consciously about why. Death, and what comes after it, occupies an enormous central place in how your entire society thinks and behaves. The idea of an afterlife isn't a vague hope here. It's treated as a literal, practical reality requiring genuine preparation. Wealthier families invest enormous resources into elaborate tombs and burial preparations. Your own family can't afford anything close to that, but even modest households take death seriously, believing firmly that proper burial and remembrance directly affects a person's fate in the world beyond this one. This belief system connects directly, you'll come to understand, to the massive building project, rising steadily from the desert not far from your village. The structure isn't simply a monument to a powerful ruler. To your entire community, it's genuinely believed to be essential, a tool that helps secure the pharaoh's successful journey into the afterlife, which in turn, according to everything you've been taught since childhood, helps maintain cosmic order and balance for absolutely everyone, including your own family. Which is part of why, when the call eventually comes for laborers, it doesn't feel like an unwelcome burden the way you might expect.
The message reaches your village during the flooding season, exactly when farming work has quietly paused across the entire region. Laborers are needed for the Pharaoh's great building project, and every household capable of sending able-bodied workers is expected to contribute. This isn't slavery, whatever popular imagination might suggest. It's closer to a structured labor obligation, sometimes called corvée duty, a rotating system where ordinary Egyptian families like yours contribute physical labor for a set period, understood as a kind of national service tied directly to both religious duty and simple practical necessity. Skilled, permanent crews of trained builders handle the most technically demanding work year-round, but during flood season specifically, thousands of additional temporary workers like you get called upon to supplement that labor force. You're old enough now, strong enough, and honestly, more curious than reluctant about the whole thing. Leaving your village for the first time in your life feels less like punishment and considerably more like genuine opportunity, a chance to see something beyond the same fields and riverbank. You've known your entire life to contribute directly to something you've been taught since childhood is genuinely sacred and important. Your family prepares what little you'll bring with you, mostly just simple clothing, since you've heard that food and shelter will actually be provided at the site itself. One of the details that genuinely surprises you when you first hear it explained. You say goodbye to your parents and younger siblings, join a small group of other young men from neighboring villages making the exact same journey, and set out toward Giza, where the structure you've glimpsed rising on the horizon for years is finally about to become the place where you'll spend the next several months of your life. Arriving at Giza for the first time is genuinely overwhelming. Nothing back in your quiet farming village prepared you for the sheer scale of what you're seeing. Thousands of workers organized into structured teams, massive limestone blocks being moved with coordinated precision, the pyramid itself rising steadily into a shape you've only ever seen from a distance. You're organized into a work gang, one of several teams given names. Some evidence suggests things like Friends of Khufu, fostering a genuine sense of team identity and friendly competition between different crews. This surprises you almost as much as anything else. You expected grim, joyless labor. Instead, you find real camaraderie, playful rivalry between teams, and a structured sense of purpose that makes the difficult physical work feel considerably more bearable. Housing here is organized and functional. A purpose-built workers' village nearby, with communal sleeping quarters, bakeries, and breweries operating at genuinely impressive scale to feed the enormous workforce. You eat noticeably well, better in some ways than you did back home actually. Bread, beer, and regularly, meat, since archaeological evidence from sites like this reveals cattle, sheep, and goats slaughtered specifically to feed workers just like you. This isn't the starvation-driven slave labor popular imagination often assumes. Rome and later sword and sandal fiction got this one seriously wrong. Medical care exists here too, more organized than what your village could ever provide. Workers with injuries receive actual treatment, evidence of set bones and healed fractures suggesting genuine effort went into caring for laborers rather than simply discarding anyone who got hurt. There's clearly a practical calculation behind this care. Healthy workers are more productive workers, and a project this ambitious depends entirely on maintaining a functional, reasonably healthy labor force over months and years of sustained effort. The actual work itself varies depending on your team's specific role. Some groups haul massive stone blocks using sledges and wet sand to reduce friction. Others work quarries, extracting and roughly shaping limestone. You spend your days rotating through demanding physical labor, coordinated shouts and rhythmic chanting, helping synchronize the movement of enormous stones that would be genuinely impossible to move through individual effort alone. By evening, exhausted but fed, you gather with your work gang, sharing food, quiet conversation, and the particular kind of bond that develops between people surviving genuinely difficult shared labor together. For all the organization and genuine care evident at the site, this work is still brutally, physically demanding, and not every day passes without real difficulty. The heat is relentless, especially during peak daylight hours, and heat stroke is a genuine, constant danger, despite regular water breaks and rest periods built into the daily schedule. You've watched fellow workers collapse from exhaustion, carried off to recover, sometimes never quite returning to full strength afterward. Your own body aches constantly during your first weeks here, muscles you didn't know you had screaming in protest every single evening. Injuries happen regularly, an unavoidable reality when you're moving multi-ton stone blocks using nothing but human muscle wooden sledges, and carefully calculated leverage. A rope snapping, a block shifting unexpectedly, a moment of lost coordination between team members. Any of these can mean crushed fingers, broken bones, or worse. You've seen serious accidents firsthand, moments that remind you sharply just how dangerous this work genuinely is, despite the medical care available afterward. Disease spreads occasionally too, an unfortunate consequence of thousands of people living and working in close proximity for extended periods. You've had your own bout of illness during your time here, days spent recovering rather than working, genuinely uncertain for a stretch whether you'd fully recover or become one of the workers who doesn't survive their labor obligation. There's also the simple, grinding exhaustion of repetition. The same demanding physical tasks, day after day, month after month. Homesickness growing steadily as you think increasingly of your family, your village, the familiar rhythm of farming life you left behind for this. Whatever genuine purpose and community you've found here doesn't erase the fact that this remains difficult, sometimes genuinely miserable labor, regardless of how well-fed or medically cared for you happen to be. Yet even during the hardest days, there's something that keeps you and your fellow workers pushing forward. Not just religious duty or simple obligation, but a strange, growing pride in watching this structure rise, stone by stone, knowing your own hands are directly part of building something that already feels larger, more permanent than anything you could have imagined back in your small riverside village. Not every day is defined entirely by labor and hardship. There are lighter moments too, ordinary human life continuing even here, even now. On rest days, you sometimes wander through the makeshift market that's grown up near the workers' village, merchants and traders drawn by the sheer size of the workforce gathered at Giza. You trade small goods, maybe a bit of extra bread or beer ration for simple pleasures, a bit of honey, a small trinket. Occasionally, news and gossip from other regions carried by travelers passing through. Music and storytelling fill quiet evenings around cooking fires. Older workers sharing tales passed down through generations, songs that help pass the time and briefly transport everyone's mind away from sore muscles and homesickness. You've picked up a few simple tunes yourself, humming them idly during long stretches of repetitive labor. Friendships formed here run surprisingly deep, considering how briefly you've actually known most of these men. Shared hardship has a way of accelerating genuine bonds, and you've made friends you genuinely expect to stay in contact with even after your labor obligation eventually ends and you return home to your family and village. Occasionally, word spreads through camp of a festival or celebration, tied to religious calendar events your entire community observes. Work pauses briefly. Extra food and beer get distributed. And for a short while, the massive, exhausting project you're all part of building fades slightly into the background, replaced by simple, genuine human celebration. Dancing, shared food, the kind of ordinary joy that exists in every era of human history, regardless of how difficult daily circumstances might otherwise be. These moments matter more than you initially expected. They remind you, and everyone around you, that you're not simply anonymous laborers serving some distant, abstract purpose. You're people, living genuine lives, even here, even now, even in the shadow of something as enormous and strange as the structure slowly rising above you every single day. Eventually, your labor obligation ends, and you make the journey back home to your village along the Nile, the same river that shaped every single day of your entire life. Your family welcomes you back with genuine relief and curiosity, eager to hear about everything you witnessed at Giza. You find yourself changed in ways that are hard to fully explain. stronger physically, certainly, but also carrying a strange, quiet pride you didn't fully expect to feel. Somewhere behind you now stands a structure that will outlast your entire family line, outlast your village, outlast nearly everything else you've ever known or will ever know. You return to farming, to the familiar rhythm of flood, planting, and harvest that will likely define the rest of your life. Maybe you'll be called upon again someday for future royal projects. Maybe this remains a singular, defining chapter in an otherwise ordinary agricultural life along the riverbank. Either way, you carry something with you now that most people throughout history never get to claim: direct physical participation in building one of the most enduring structures human beings have ever created. You'll never fully know, standing in your family's modest mud brick home years later, just how long this pyramid will actually stand, or how many future generations across thousands of years will look up at it in genuine awe, wondering exactly who built it and what their lives were actually like. You were an ordinary person, a farmer's child, a laborer, a builder, living an ordinary life along an extraordinary river. And somewhere in that structure rising from the desert, a small, permanent piece of your own life remains, quietly built into history itself. So, could you have lived this life? Not as a pharaoh or a general, but as one of thousands of ordinary hands that actually built one of the ancient world's greatest wonders? That's exactly the kind of story we love telling here. Not just the famous names history remembers, but the real, lived experience of the ordinary people who actually built, fought, and survived through history's most defining moments. Subscribe if you want more of these.